is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
For United Nations peacekeepers, the past 5 years has been the deadliest period in history. According to a December 2017 report, the UN flag no longer offers the natural protection it once did, and the missions in Africa are the most vulnerable. Since 2013, an influx of armed groups, extremists and organized crime has led to 26 blue helmet casualties in Sudan, 29 in the Central African Republic and 91 in Mali. And the report has called for better training, more technology and greater freedom for peacekeepers in response to these numbers. So how can the UN adapt to deal with this new climate of conflict? And what more can be done to make it safer for UN peacekeepers on the continent? I'm Lindy Mtongana. Welcome to Talk Africa. Peacekeeping, as defined by the United Nations, is a way to help countries torn by conflict to create conditions for sustainable peace. And of the 15 current UN operations, 5 of the major missions are in Africa. The longest running is the United Nations mission in Liberia, established in 2003 to support the implementation of the peace process. It currently consists of 1,481 deployed personnel and has seen 201 fatalities. On 30th June 2016, the mission completed the transfer of security responsibilities to Liberian authorities and is expected to complete their withdrawal this year. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, MONUSCO took over from an earlier UN peacekeeping operation in 2010. Over 20,000 deployed personnel from over 30 countries, it's seen 144 fatalities in the past 7 years. However, previous operations have been running in the region since 1999. South Sudan became the newest country in the world on the 9th of July 2011, but the UN mission there was in fact established 24 hours before that on the 8th. More than 17,000 personnel have only seen 51 fatalities. However, the majority of those have been since 2014, when the UN reinforced UNMISS and reprioritized its mandate towards the protection of civilians. The United Nations Multi-Dimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, or MINUSMA, has become one of the global body's highest priorities and has been labeled the world's deadliest peacekeeping operation. Close to 15,000 personnel have been deployed in efforts against Al-Qaeda-linked radicals. 155 blue helmets have lost their lives since 2011, and at least 91 of those in the past 4 years alone. And finally, MONUSCO is the youngest mission on the continent. Since 2014, their objective has been to support the transition processes in the Central African Republic. But as of December 2017, 59 out of just over 14,000 deployed personnel have already lost their lives. Well, now, according to a new UN report, more peacekeepers have been killed since 2013 than in any other 5-year period in history. In an ambitious attempt to turn the tide, the UN is undertaking steps to fix the problem from within the organization. CGTN's Lilling Tan reports.
There were 56 peacekeeping fatalities in 2017, the highest number of peacekeeping deaths in more than 2 decades, according to the United Nations.
We're being attacked by armed groups who are looting, killing, raping. And they have no interest in peaceful solution. So it's because we have this very different dangerous environment that we have to change.
The UN's blue helmets also face multiple threats from terrorism, organized crime, and criminal exploitation.
The typical peacekeeping operation is no longer inserting neutral troops between 2 warring sides to prevent a conflict from re-emerging. What you have over the years is a much more dynamic situation, where you have multiple non-state actors fighting across multiple states, particularly in Central Africa, and it's no longer a situation where peacekeepers can sort of get between them.
But the UN has been criticized for not adapting to this different climate of conflict.
I certainly think the idea that UN peacekeeping has not caught up to the 21st century is true. We have a 20th century UN in general trying to deal with 21st century problems, including the problems that peacekeepers face in the field.
But now a new UN report has identified key peacekeeping deficiencies, including a lack of leadership, inaction, and a reluctance to use force when necessary, outdated interpretations of basic peacekeeping principles, and the lack of technology and intel. The report reflects a genuine acknowledgement of the shortcomings of UN peacekeeping, and an accompanying action plan provides an ambitious blueprint to correct them. But this latest attempt to fix peacekeeping from within comes in the midst of both new obstacles and long-running challenges. UN peacekeeping last year took a budget cut of $600 million, including a 7.5% rollback in US funding under the Trump administration, at a time when UN peacekeeping is under growing pressure to change the way it operates.
Why is this important? Because peacekeeping is, I think, probably in some ways the one area that is further ahead in terms of some of the reforms that need to take place, but it's also the area where the UN is most vulnerable, because nothing strikes at the idea of an international community or at the idea of the Charter of the United Nations quite like watching civilians die in places of armed conflict while the UN is standing to the side or is unable to do anything to help them.
The reputation of UN peacekeepers hasn't been stellar either.
Of course, you have a lot of issues with sexual abuse, with human trafficking, with all sorts of kind of horrifying human rights abuses that have been perpetrated by peacekeepers. So I think you have a situation where you need to work on the rules of engagement. You also need to deal with supervision, and you also need to deal with procurement.
The report is a long to-do list, but the big question is whether this latest stock-taking by an organization viewed as slow to adapt can finally bring substantial change to the way Blue Helmets keep the peace in places where there is often little peace to keep. Lilingtan, CGTN, New York.
At the recently concluded African Union Summit, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said he would like to strengthen the partnership between the AU and the UN, especially in terms of peace and security. The AU, meanwhile, has said it wants to become more proactive and insists on its inclusion on all decisions linked to peace operations on the continent. CGTN's Guru Mchala spoke to the head of the African Union Peace Support Operations, Sivuyile Bam, to get an assessment of the African missions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bam, for talking to CGTN now. What is the African Union's general assessment of the performance of the United Nations peacekeeping missions in Africa in recent years?
The issue of peace mission is quite a complicated concept that has evolved over time, and it is one of the toolboxes that our organizations, both the UN and the AU, are using as a response to conflict. The assessment is that there are instances where there has been progress and we've had the returns, but also the reality is that in some of the areas the evolution of the conflict itself has put on challenges to those operations that have been on the ground. Hence then both organizations have undertaken at different epochs in their development of assessment of either the doctrine, like the African Union, we are now developing or revising or need to develop the AU Peace Support Operations Doctrine. At the same time, the AU has just published a report, the UN has just published a report about the types of conflicts that they are engaged in, the protection of their personnel. So this is truly a reflection of a recognition by both organizations that the issue of peace support operations is not static, it evolves. It must adapt to the new and emerging threats and conflicts that we are employing our forces to and personnel to.
Does it worry the AU that Africa has the highest number of peacekeeping missions than any other region globally?
Not really. The issue is not that we have the highest missions globally. The issue is whether both organizations recognize that we are in this together, which is the key principle, that the United Nations, as it is primarily responsible for international peace and security, has recognized that on its own it cannot respond to that responsibility. It cannot on its own be able to deal with those issues. Therefore, there is a need for it to interact with regional organizations. There are other issues that the UN is grappling with in other regions of the world. They might not necessarily be the same as ours. For example, in some of the continents in the world, there are issues about narco trade, which the UN is busy dealing with. It might not necessarily be the same conflict issues as we are dealing with, but those are still conflicts, because those are issues of contestation of state authority, the ability of the states to be able to deliver to their own people, and the threat that is posed by those organizations to the ability of governance, to the issues relating to human security and related matters.
Now, take us through what your understanding of the UN peacekeeping missions are, and whether the AU is satisfied that the missions are, living up to their mandate.
Yes, the AU thinks they are. I mean, in the recently held joint task force, which is between the AU Commission and the UN Secretariat at the highest level of our principal commissioners on our side, on the UN side at the level of the Under-Secretary Generals. There is a clear message that is being sent out that we need to work harder. We need to work together, to cooperate. We need to coordinate our work. We need to ensure that we read from the same page. This has also been pronounced by our councils, the Peace and Security Council, the UN and Security Council in their meetings, that there is a need for us to be able to coordinate and to be able to cooperate in this regard. I think we need to note that these are intrastate or interstate institutions that we are working with. So there's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to whatever we're doing. The complexity of the conflict will necessarily mean that we need to adapt our tools to those issues that are confronting us.
Now, what would a stronger Africa-UN partnership entail in the area of peacekeeping?
Currently, the efforts are that it would mean joint planning, it would mean joint assessments, it would mean joint recognition and acceptance of the outcomes and the failures of the challenges that we are facing. Remember, the member states of the AU are member states of the UN. So we draw from the same pool. It's not that these organizations, the member states that form them, are different. So a strong partnership between these organizations would send a very strong message to the belligerents that if you touch the AU or you touch the UN, we shall respond accordingly. So those who are against peace, those who are continuously transgressing international provisions of protection of civilians, responsibility to protect, will get a very clear message that we shall be coming for you in whatever form, be it peace building, be it peacekeeping operation, be it sanctions, whatever tools we have at our disposal, we shall make sure that we are able to deliver peace and security to the continent, of course in conjunction with other players. So a strong partnership gives a better likelihood of peace and livelihood for the people of Africa.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have more insights into the risks involved with UN peacekeeping efforts in Africa. Stay with us.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
to bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now to offer more insights into UN peacekeeping missions in Africa, as well as the risks involved. I have expert guests with me in studio, Mr. Mwenda Mbijiwe, the security analyst and CEO of Eye on Security, as well as Dr. Mustafa Ali, a security and conflict transformation expert. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining in this conversation. Now, the central fact that has basically put this topic on the table is the fact that the UN peacekeeping missions have seen more deaths in the past 5 years than in any other 5-year period of their history. The majority of those deaths taking place in Africa. Dr. Ali, I'll start with you. Why is Africa the most dangerous place on the continent for UN peacekeepers, in the world really, for UN peacekeepers?
Yeah, thank you. One of the issues really that is making these missions very dangerous and the increasing number of deaths on the UN peacekeepers is that we have increasingly non-state actors involved in these conflicts. And non-state actors do not subscribe to any of the international laws in the asymmetric sense of the conflicts that we have involving violent extremism and terrorism. The rebels are fighting on their own. In the past and in other conflicts, you have state actors that are belligerents. They are the ones who are fighting, and therefore they subscribe to the tenets of the United Nations. Groups like Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, or the Allied Democratic Force operating in Uganda or Congo do not subscribe to any of the UN tenets. In fact, do not recognize the UN peacekeepers.
And then this brings us to, of course, this really important question of if the nature of conflict has changed in various parts of the world, especially here in Africa, that then suggests that the UN itself and the way that it manages peacekeeping operations needs to fundamentally change too. What's your view?
I agree with you unreservedly, because the UN for a long time has hung on the, and I'll use the word false belief that when they go to a conflict zone, that zone is so desperate for peace that their presence means everything is fine, all guns are silent, let's have peace. But conflict has since evolved. These groups, as my co-panelist said earlier, they are also evolving in their weapons, in the approach to the conflict itself. They are either terrorists or extremists of some kind, rebel groups and movements. They don't want peace. In Africa, most of those rebels want the resources in Africa. They want the gold, they want the diamonds. When the UN comes, it's a necessary disruption to them. Now the UN comes speaking peace, and these people come speaking, we don't want peace. And the UN has not been able to read the changing terrain for a long time. So the UN ends up being trapped in a situation where they are singing peace and these guys are singing war, and the UN is not able to conform to educate them on what it means to have peace.
This does bring us now to the cruise report that many people are talking about, a report looking into the rise in casualties of UN peacekeepers and making some key recommendations, one of them being the use of force. Now, many have been surprised by the blunt language used in this particular report, and I'll just quote directly from it, and it reminds me of just what you've said now, that hostile forces do not understand a language other than force. The United Nations needs to be strong and not to fear to use force. Missions should go where the threat is in order to neutralize it. Just coming back to what you said earlier, isn't this quite a departure from the emphasis on political solutions and dialogue that we're used to when it comes to the UN?
Take the UN peacekeeping force to an ISIS zone in Syria, for example, and deploy those soldiers to come into contact with ISIS fighters and teach them peace. They ain't gonna hear any of that talk. First of all, they must be approached from a military perspective. And then that military perspective, that use of force perspective, you educate them from force towards peace. they first of all must realize that their gun, when they shoot someone, someone is going to shoot at them. And then you disarm them and you put them in camps and detention centers where you train and teach them on peace.
Okay.
But you can't just walk in there shouting peace.
Dr. Ali, do you agree? I see you have a reaction there to this militarization of UN peacekeepers.
Yeah, first of all, the UN is trying to address or to respond or intervene in new forms of conflict using very old tactics of peacekeeping. Okay. So they mean well, but the tactics and the approach is just wrong. My colleague has said that you cannot, you have a group in Syria, Iraq that has declared caliphate and they've declared everybody infidels, and therefore they're going to kill whoever they find that do not subscribe to their ideology. And so the UN is not the organization or the body to send soldiers there. What should happen is that states should come together, either under the aegis of the regional organization, in this case perhaps the Arab League or the Gulf Cooperation Council, for the case of the Middle East, in Africa under ECOWAS or IGAD or the Africa Union, to be able to respond to regional challenges. Remember, most of these conflicts are regional actually, and the regional bodies understand the terrain, they understand the complexities, they understand the environment in which these conflicts are actually transformed. And when UN comes in, and in some cases invoke Chapter 7, then who else is going to come in and keep peace when the guns are silent?
And looking specifically at MONUSCO, we know now that this is the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC. It's known as MONUSCO, but online on Twitter, you'll see that critics are calling it MONUSLess. Do you think that the UN peacekeeping mission, particularly in Africa, might be losing some credibility?
Actually, the case of the Congo is a little unique, because very many of us in Africa really feel that actually the Congo didn't need a peacekeeping. And many of us actually think that the Congo is trapped in a resource conflict more than any other kind of conflict that we've seen elsewhere. There are regions like Rwanda where we know there was ethnic conflict. Other regions like Liberia and Sierra Leone in the past that have had ethnic conflict. But that one of the Congo is kind of a creation, something that has been created. That's why they feel the UN peacekeeping in the Congo is first of all needless there. It's useless, like they are saying. It's needless to be there. However, let's also say the truth. If there's a conflict, it doesn't matter where it is. And for what reason, the UN needs to be seen as that great brother, that bigger brother who comes in and enforces peace in a situation. But as my colleague alluded to earlier, I think the UN must adopt the tactic of working with the regional powers and see it's working in Somalia. I just came back from Mogadishu few days back, and the African Union in Mogadishu and other parts of Somalia have done a brilliant job. When you bring the regional forces, the countries that are within the conflict area, they understand the terrain. They understand most of the conflict leaders live actually across the borders of the conflict regions in the countries that are within. So it's easier for us here in Kenya to look for the guys who are leading conflict in Somalia and say, you will not come to Nairobi unless you resolve the conflict in Somalia. So the UN must adapt to the changing conflict nature and styles. If they don't and stick to the old Chapter 7, Chapter 6, then the UN is going to be needless, and I can assure you in another 10, 20 years we will actually phase out the UN and create something else for ourselves in the world.
Dr. Ali, I just want to pick up on this, the theory that you raised, that the best way for the UN to work is to partner with regional bodies or state actors. But we know, of course, that the UN peacekeeping mission's core values are consent, impartiality, and non-use of force unless absolutely necessary. What happens to impartiality then if the UN is working directly with states?
You see, when the UN is working working directly and trying to not keep peace but to enforce peace, UN then is forced to invoke Chapter 7 and is forced then to pursue and use overwhelming force to subdue the enemy, where it's supposedly present to keep peace. And so there's no peace to keep in theory and in practice, but there is open a war. And so it's easier. It's easier, it makes more sense when the regional bodies, whether it's ECOWAS, we saw what ECOWAS did in West Africa, in Liberia and Sierra Leone. It was very effective. And then UN came and kept the peace, and that worked. In DR Congo, UN is there directly. And we see that, people are not even now taking the United Nations seriously. But if the African Union was really empowered to an extent that is able to mobilize resources and send a mission into DR Congo to enforce peace, that would work. Then, when that peace is enforced, so when all these rebel groups have been subdued, then the UN can come and keep the peace. Peacekeeping is more dovish, and UN is very good at that. The problem here is that AU is unable to do that.
Just as far as closing comments are concerned from both of you, what do you think UN peacekeeping missions need to focus on, particularly in Africa, to be more effective and, of course, to spare the loss of lives in the coming future?
Yeah, first of all, well, these soldiers do a very good job in countries that they are sent to go and keep or enforce peace. Unfortunately, some of them misbehave, some of them engage in trafficking, some of them do engage in rape, some of them engage in sexual exploitation of children. We've seen that in the Central African Republic and in Congo. And it's very important that the United Nations is seen not to be covering these criminal acts that are committed by soldiers who are going to keep or enforce peace. And in fact, they taint the name of the countries that are sending them there and that of the United Nations. One thing that my colleague has said is training. Training is key. And it's very important that these soldiers are trained and sufficiently prepared to know that it's not just peacekeeping that they are going to do. Sometimes they are called to do and engage in peace enforcement, and that means actual fighting. And also they need to be trained on cultural issues. That you don't just send in a battalion that does not understand if that battalion is going to interact with the population. It becomes very difficult for them if they are not prepared in training to interact culturally or in any other way with the populations that they are going to be serving.
Indeed. And any final words from you, Mr. Mbijiwe?
Well, I thank the UN leadership, from the Secretary General to the wing that handles peacekeeping, that they thought of examining this. We know the leader, the commander of the UN mission in Rwanda, a general from Canada, suffered almost irredeemable post-traumatic stress disorders, because as genocide was going on in Rwanda, there's nothing he could do. He had his hands completely tied by the UN peacekeeping terms of engagement. And this general here he's been in and out of hospital for the longest. But if the UN is doing this kind of a survey, it means they want to minimize cases of such generals happening in the future, and actually making sure that the missions are effective and sometimes even shorter, because these missions take longer if they cannot enforce peace sometimes. So when the bad boys and the conflict, they call them belligerent forces, when they know these soldiers coming can actually kill us, then they agree to talk. And sometimes that's all you need.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's very true. I think what you both pointed on there is that conflict is changing and the UN peacekeeping missions need to change too. That is all we have time for this week, but thank you very much to my guests for their insights. Dr. Mustafa Ali, Security and Conflict Transformation Expert, and Mwenda Mbijiwe, Security Analyst and CEO of Eye on Eye Security. Now remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Lindy Mtongana, it's goodbye.